Hi, my name is Bridget Richardson. I'm the Assistant Director of Ecumenical and Pastoral Initiatives at the Nesty Center for Faith and Culture at University of St. Thomas in Houston. And I'm here with my good friend, Ben Pickett. He's an executive minister at West Houston Church of Christ in Northwest Houston. So thank you so much for joining me today, Ben.
Yeah, thank you, Bridget. Glad to be back.
Yeah, and today we're talking about what most churches are doing right now. It's coming back together to meet. And you right now are back in your office at West Houston. So what does that feel like?
Yeah, it's different, obviously. We opened our offices late last week, and what that meant is that ministers and administrative staff formally came back to work, so to speak, in the office rather than working from home. And of course, we've been very cognizant and honoring of Governor Abbott's Open Texas guidelines and protocols because those are statewide and transcend any local or county rules or laws or guidelines that are posted. So we've been very specific about honoring those. And so that means, we're in a kind of a weird spot. We're in an office, right? But we're also a church. So do we follow the church guidelines for managing office, or do we follow the office guidelines in a church context? And so we decided to go with the latter. And so obviously people wearing masks, we have to be mindful how many people are in the office at one time. We're honoring distancing for meetings and such. And so, yeah, it looks different, as you might imagine.
Yeah, and what you're even touching on is things that we talk about at the Nesty Center for Faith and Culture a lot about faithful citizenship, and what that looks like lived out as a Christian in the United States. So I think, holding that intention and walking that line and thinking critically about that is really important.
It is, our first call as Christians is to love God and love neighbor. Okay. So what's been motivating, and I pray has been motivating church activity from the beginning, was a desire to love neighbor. And at the same time, we're also very cognizant of the importance of the gathered community. And so many churches are coming back and opening now. And thankfully, we're in a particular context where the impact of the virus has not been as prevalent as it has been in other parts of the country. And that doesn't mean we take it less seriously. It just simply means that we are open to moving forward. There are even some churches here in our community that are choosing to remain online. But what we're noticing is that our online presence, the amount of number of hits, if you will, or the viewership online is slowly declining, particularly at the beginning of the month.
Yeah, so as you
so because of that, I guess the reason it's declining, that kind of gives us a reason to start thinking seriously about opening up again.
Mm-hmm. And you're taking that very seriously, right? I know in your communication, you've sent out a lot of different things about the plans for it. So tell us a little bit about what that's been like for you and your team to put it together, considering, the public coming back.
Yeah, so there's tensions, right? There's tensions about wearing or not wearing a mask. There's more information than you want on the internet to explain the efficacy or inefficacy of masks or different types of masks. You're hearing a lot now about what singing can do to spread the virus. That, of course, assumes if the virus is in your community. Well, to what degree can we assume it is or is not? See those questions? And so we're having to balance the guidelines and our desire to honor and love neighbor by being as safe as we can, while also responding to the very real need that Christians are Christian in community. And to be Christian in isolation simply isn't part of the biblical narrative, nor is it consistent with a healthy spirituality. And so we're having to think very critically about what measures we do bring about as people come back on campus, and how those measures are implemented. So, for example, when folks come in, when they come into the auditorium, we've divvied off the pews, every other pew, right? We've asked every person in a church is a volunteer environment, so we've asked every person that when you come in, your family units should have 2 seats or 6 feet between other family units on the same pew. Okay, we're going hands-free, so we're going to use the little communion packets rather than passing the trays, things like that. And then, of course, we're going to ask everyone who comes on campus to use hand sanitizer when they come to the doors. And so it's going to be like this for a season. That's our prayer. But we feel this is important to do and measures that we can do for the sake of neighbor and to try to limit the spread of disease as much as we can.
Yeah, and you and I have talked about how when you do put in these precautions and everything, you want to keep people safe, and your leadership, that's the main goal, is just to keep people safe and to show that love of Christ through these precautions. And you still want people to feel that community of church. So how do you still perpetuate that community of church and coming together and being familial in that space? I know West Houston is such a beautiful community of everyone is welcome. You come in that door, you're greeted by several people, you're made to feel welcome. There's usually hugs and handshakes and things like that for the physical touch, but how are you and your leadership still trying to make that community palpable?
Yeah, in regard to what happens when we come on campus, our mood, our attitude is very important. Anxiety is infectious. And so for us, as we plan for Sunday, our plan is to encourage folks who are serving as greeters to just remind them, look, we're in this is God's house, God's community, and folks are going to be excited to be back. And even though we have to honor these protocols, there's no reason to be afraid. There's no reason to be anxious. Okay. We are instituting these measures to increase the safety, but we also recognize that in these kinds of gatherings, regardless of whether it's us or another church or another faith tradition, when you come together as a group in a volunteer environment, there's always going to be risks. Okay? And the thing about it is we live with risk before COVID. Okay? We lived with that. And so I think the heightened anxiety of our culture right now, because of the infectious nature of this disease or this virus, has kind of brought about another subtle form of anxiety where things are pretty tense. And so setting the mood, we're going to have some signage and some other things that we want to make sure people know that they're welcome when they come on campus. And we anticipate guests. In fact, we got a notification. We're going to have some folks here that haven't been to West Houston before. So what's it going to be like to experience a church for the first time in COVID season? Think about that for a second.
Right.
Okay. Are they going to encounter a group that is nervous as a cat and afraid to even look at somebody else because of the virus? Are they going to encounter a group that's taking all the measures as they should, but are also embracing the joy that we have in Christ, to recognize that God is still sovereign, that Jesus isn't subject to social distancing, and that the beauty of having God in our presence, okay, necessarily reminds us of the joy that we have as Christians, of the power to overcome fear that comes by embracing the gospel, embracing the presence of Christ, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so that's my prayer. That's our prayer for this Sunday, is that fears don't overcome us, that anxiety doesn't pervade the day. That's our hope. And it's by God's grace that will happen. And you can't manufacture this stuff, right? You can certainly step out and say, look, this is our calling, and this is where we feel we need to go, and embrace it as best we can while being very mindful of the safety of others.
And Ben, you touch on something that's so integral to this whole experience. I know many, many churches have seen how being online in these past few months has been an evangelization tool, where they've had their numbers so high, sometimes exceed their membership even. So they're good. There may be new people there, right? There may be people who saw you online and they're like, you know what, if they're opening, I want to go check it out. So how would you encourage even the faithful who are attending to remember, you're here with your family, you're back again, but there may be new people here too.
Yeah, that's real. Without a doubt, the online presence and the fact that for several weeks everybody was confined to their home meant that more people were watching your online services and your online expressions of worship and finding life in that. But since things have opened up, that's been steadily declining. And yet, we know that newcomers have noticed or have at least tuned in to some degree. And so for us here, again, it's about focusing on neighbor, but instead of focusing on the safety of neighbor, now we're focusing on a neighbor who's seeking community, who's having to endure what might possibly be the longest season of self-isolation the world has ever seen. Where all of us have been forced into our homes worldwide at some point in time, and have been deprived of the joys of being in community with others at some level, right? And so it's about, we still have to maintain the distancing. We still have to talk about elbows or no handshakes, no hugs. But there's this other piece, though, that we've been talking about also, is that when the church comes back together, there is going to be some joy. And what happens when there's that one member who feels like, you know what, I'm uncomfortable wearing a mask, or I want to shake your hand. Okay. Why? Because they're in desperate need of presence of another in some way. Okay. Or we talked about this also. What happens when that child or student that knows you as a minister really well, okay, whether you're a children's minister or a student minister or any other role in the life of the church, priest, pastor, whatever, and they haven't seen you in months, and you see them for the first time in months, and that little child, out of the impulse and love of their heart, runs over to you and wants a hug. Okay. Now, what do? Okay. There is no way that I'm turning that child away. There is no way I'm doing that. Now, whether that happens or not, I don't know. But this is where our love for neighbor and love for Christ transcends our fears and even some of the risks involved. Now, I know some people will hear that and find that controversial or think, wait a minute, are you not violating the rules you've already talked about? I said, yeah, but what's most important here? Okay. And so these are the conversations we're dealing with. And Bridget, it brings us to a place where we have to make some really important calls about the kind of people we're going to be, even in the midst of a pandemic. And so these are just part of the challenges that your question necessarily raises.
Yeah, and I think having those conversations and talking about it is the point, right? Like not talking about it and not going there as a team to think through the tough things is probably the worst thing that you could do. Having those tough conversations and thinking about how to truly encounter the other in the real practicality of opening the church is where growth happens, where the Spirit has the room to come in and infuse our our understanding of what actually we should do as Christians, right?
It is. And here's the thing, the challenge of the season we're in is that people are on different places on the spectrum of responses. And I don't think anyone, I think there's a great deal of respect for the different views that are being expressed. At least that's our prayer that there is. Okay. The mask, no mask conversation, for example, okay, is a big one, particularly in Texas, okay? I've had folks tell me, I'm coming to church, I'm not wearing a mask, okay? I've had folks tell me, I'm coming to church and I'm going to wear my mask the entire time. I've had folks tell me, I'm not coming to church Sunday because I might have my mask, but somebody else might have theirs, and I'm uncomfortable about the risk that involves. I get that, okay? And I think our calling as leaders is to respect all those positions. And that's why we're calling this a hybrid season, where our online presence is going to be maintained at the same level it has been. But in the meantime, now we're opening up our assemblies to worshiping in person. So it's a hybrid season. We're doing both out of love and respect for people who are having different opinions, even in our church, on what's best for them. And so that's at the heart of it, really.
And as you're bringing all of those voices together, and it's so indicative of what we experience in culture, right? There's so many viewpoints. There's so many people coming from different sides on things. And I love at West Houston, when you leave the parking lot, it has that sign that says you're entering the mission field. And we are, as Christians, we have a missionary purpose. And so how do you and your team think that, regardless of where people stand in that arena of mask, no mask, I'm staying home, I'm watching online, I want to be there with my family, how would you encourage that missionary spirit to be, to cut through all of the differences in opinion?
Yeah, on this thing, on what the environment in which we currently live, every individual has to choose what's in their best interest for safety right now. And we're empowering our church to ask those questions. Okay. And so we're making sure in our announcements and literature that people feel comfortable staying at home as much as they would feel comfortable coming to church. We're endorsing that. Okay. Because there are folks that are in an at-risk category that it's in their best interest to stay home. It's best for them to stay home because if they were to get infected with the virus, they are at a higher risk of some really big problems as opposed to other groups that don't have the risks that they have for various reasons that we're all familiar with. And so that's the first thing I would say is we want to give folks the grace and permission to stay home if you want to stay home. And at the same time, if you feel like you're comfortable coming to worship, come to worship and be present, okay, as best you can, while showing love and dignity to others who, even on campus, may be expressing a disposition on masks, for example, that are different from my own, okay? And so we're working and hopefully setting a tone that says, look, we're going to be gracious to one another. We're going to be welcoming to one another. And under no circumstances are we going to use any shame or guilt for not attending, or if we're attending in a way that maybe is different from my opinion on how you should attend. We're still in a volunteer environment. People choose to come or not to assembly of their own free will. And so we're inviting them to make responsible choices. For example, we're not using thermometers. Some churches are doing that because because we do believe that when we ask the church to be responsible about whether they should come to church or not, if they're not feeling well, we ask them to stay home, and that's okay, you see. And that's so different for us in Churches of Christ, by the way. Historically, in Churches of Christ, we placed a lot of emphasis on attendance, and we really have, about being present. And that was and is still a high priority. Among the Protestant traditions, we have a higher percentage of our membership that attends on a regular basis than some of the older Protestant traditions. It's surprising when you start looking at some of the numbers, but and so it's a big deal for the church to have assemblies, and some of our church members not attend. It's a big deal because for some of them, church attendance is very much a part of their faith expression. Okay, and so us giving them permission, if you will, and that's really not even the right word. The better way to say it, us encouraging folks, if you're ill or if you're at risk, to stay home is really important for them to hear.
Yeah, and just to finish it up, where can we all experience Jesus in this dialogue and conversation as we try to journey with one another to, I like how you kept saying, grace, mercy, and joy. How can Jesus infuse our actions and our thoughts and the way that we interact with each other moving forward?
I think if we remind ourselves that Christ is present, okay, that Christ is sovereign over COVID. He's sovereign even when our church assemblies may look a little different. Yes, we have blue tape like everybody else. Okay, and sometimes I have no doubt that the blue tape will remind us that we're in a COVID season, when often in worship we go to a place where we can kind of close off the world for just a little while, and be present with God. And so Christ reminds us, if we come to worship Sunday, whether it's online or in person, it is Christ that unifies us. It is Christ that brings us together, because we are a volunteer environment. So what is it that's motivating us to come together? Well, it's Christ. It's our commitment to Jesus. And so my hope is, at least from my perspective, is that our love for Jesus, our love for God, will be the lens through which we see both neighbor and guest. It'll be the lens through which we respond to others who may hold views different from ours, whether it's masks or you name it, the things that can divide us, that the evil one uses to divide us. I pray that we're looking through the lens of Christ to see others above ourselves. Luke 9:23, if you want to be my disciple, you must deny yourself, take up your cross daily, and follow me. Okay, denial of self, to see the other as greater than ourselves, is at the heart of the gospel. And so I think that's how Christ is going to bring us all back together, at least at our church, is by helping us see that our love for Jesus inspires us to love others and to express our love in worship. And whether that's through praise, whether that's through reaching out to a neighbor that's really going to be hard to recognize in a mask, but we're going to do it anyway, right? And is willing to, and also is willing to let Christ help us overcome our fears and anxieties. Think of how many times Christ said, "Do not fear." And so I don't think that do not fear is only limited to certain things. I think that's all of life. So there's that.
Well, Ben, I always learn something from you. I'm so proud to call you a friend and to just be a fly on the wall to hear you share so vulnerably and to be so open about what you're doing at West Houston and what your team is trying to accomplish and the care you're trying to show to all of your members and all of your guests. So thank you so much for having this conversation with me today.
Yeah, thank you, Bridget. I always appreciate our conversations, your good questions, and I'm delighted that we get to share in this time together. And thanks for the kind of the bookend. I was honored to talk about all this back in March when it first started, and grateful we can share again today. So thank you.